Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in this panel discussion with Professor Stephen Howe. My name is Miguel Amado. I'm the director of Sirius Arts Centre, an arts organization based in Cove, County Cork, in Ireland. And we have been developing a series of online panel discussions that we have named the William Thompson Forum, in honor of William Thompson, who was a radical progressive thinker based in County Cork in the 19th century, and who was seen as by many as the first Irish socialist, and really was a fundamental thinker and social maker in those times around questions surrounding feminism, questions around inequality and the distribution of wealth, questions around feminism, questions around ecology. So while our series of panel discussions is not necessarily relating to that time, neither to the figure, we believe that it is important to bring some of his ideas or to update some of his ideas into our days and use those to basically explore current urgencies and topics that we feel are important to address today. So this is the third event in the series, and we are very honored with the opportunity to hear from Professor Stephen Howe, who is a specialist in histories that relate to the imperialism, colonialism, and others. And we are also joined by a series of our constituents, people who are part of our collective effort at Sirius Arts Centre to make the organization a public resource and an institution that has a strong civic mind and a civic role. So we will hear first from Stephen, and then there will be an opportunity for questions, and hopefully the debate will be illuminating a debate that is really relevant today in light of current events that have to do with settler colonialism elsewhere in the world, but also a debate that is really important in light of the centenary of the Irish War of Independence, and more broadly, questions that have been emerging in recent years around legacies of empire and questions surrounding colonialism and capitalism. Thank you so much, Stephen, for being with us. I'm more than happy to hand over to you now, and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you for that, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very sorry that we can't all be meeting in person. I'm very fond of Cork City and County ever since spending family holidays there as a child, mostly in West Cork. So great regret that we're doing this only via Zoom, which, of course, I should be, and in a way I am, all too familiar with talking and holding discussions only on Zoom for well over a year now, but it still feels strange and artificial nonetheless. Now, in Britain in the last few years, as in many other European countries, especially but not only countries that were former imperial powers, there has been a whole new renewed critical attention to the legacies of. I'm sure you'll all be familiar with some of the things that have fed that. The Rhodes Must Fall and Black Lives Matter movements, starting in South Africa and the USA respectively. The whole Brexit debate, which some people have seen as being all about imperial nostalgia in Britain. And arising out of all that and more, there have been very widespread calls to decolonize schools and universities, museums, historical sites of memory, and more. Now, so far as I've seen, I've tried to follow Irish affairs fairly closely, there's been rather little echo of all this in Ireland, though there have been some intriguing manifestations, and I might note, for instance, how your president, Michael D., himself back in February, held a series of seminars and wrote some articles about centenary historical reflections, including ones specifically on the legacies of empire. Because after all, most historians would agree that modern Irish history has throughout been intimately associated with the history of the British Empire. But beyond that sort of minimal consensus, there's been quite wide and sometimes deep dispute, with some academics and others, public intellectuals, etc., viewing the entirety of Ireland's past in colonial terms, and sometimes seeing its present as distinctively post-colonial. And many political writers and activists, especially ones from the Republican tradition, have shared that view and expressed it in a rather different style, often being especially concerned to press a case that contemporary Northern Ireland remains subject to British imperialism, or to a specifically settler colonial legacy. Here we might note that in that sense, Irish, specifically Northern Irish debate, has joined a global wave of argument that has increasingly seen settler colonialism as something totally distinct, really, from empires or colonialisms in general. Surprise, surprise, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been the most contentious of those global arenas where settler colonialism has really become a buzzword in the very recent past. In Ireland, as elsewhere, these developments and debates among historians and other intellectuals and scholars have become intertwined with a number of other disputes. One is the widespread belief, apparently, though I think it's tended to weaken in the very recent past, that viewing the Irish past in colonial terms means adopting not just a national but a nationalist set of assumptions or beliefs. So directly political arguments have become intertwined with historical investigations of colonialism's place in Irish history. This included the long-running, surely now rather exhausted, debate between so-called historical revisionists and their opponents. It included debate over whether Ulster's Protestant community should be viewed as settler colonialists or perhaps rather as a separate nationality, and as I just implied, whether the contemporary might aptly be seen as post-colonial, even neocolonial. Naturally, the historical argument has been different in relation to different times and places of the Irish past. Some periods, like the 16th and 17th century, have appeared to many historians to offer more explanatory power in the concepts of imperialism and colonialism than have the more recent past, say the 19th and 20th centuries. And for a long time, there tended to be, frankly, a rather insular focus to these debates. That is, not many people were at all systematically comparing Irish experience with empires elsewhere and colonies elsewhere. And there tended, perhaps too often, to be a set of strong but not always argued for value judgments built in. Now, for some, labeling something colonial was more about condemning it than explaining it. Now, I've in the past written quite a lot, sometimes quite combatively on those debates and contestations, though maybe I should say, since some spheres of Irish historical debate, not least debate over exactly whom and why in Cork 100 years ago, have been a bit bad tempered. The debates I've been involved in, I'm happy to say, usually been personally quite amicable, perhaps I could say in a left wing forum, comradely, rather than personalised and acrimonious. Also, those negative judgments I implied a moment ago become quite rapidly ever less true. There's been a really fast growing and impressive literature on Ireland's place in the British Imperial system, Irish attitudes to empire, Irish involvement in British and other global imperial formations. For perhaps we should remember, the Irish have often been seen not only as colonised, but as colonisers, with many Irish emigrants to settler colonies elsewhere, and many Irish people involved prominently in helping run the British Empire. But so really, the historical literature has become ever more rich and impressive, and often ever more involving a strongly comparative element. And that's included, I think, very importantly, ever more attention to comparing Irish experience with other imperial ones within Europe, because, of course, the notion, once at least quite widespread, that really Ireland must be thought of either as a European country or as a historically colonised country is a false antithesis and misleading. A great deal of European history is colonial history, at least from one perspective. I think also the richening and broadening of these historical debates and the moving away from certain entrenched assumptions owes quite a lot to contemporary political developments, not least the partial end, I have to say still, of organised violence in Northern Ireland, or the nearly complete ending of it. And it's noteworthy that whereas in recent history, Sinn Féin and the Provisional IRA regarded theirs as an anti-imperialist struggle, and this was central to their political worldview, Sinn Féin has more recently almost entirely dropped that language, and it's very rarely used overtly in contemporary Northern Irish political debate. As to whether Irish reflections of Brexit debates have had a distinctively imperial or post-imperial dimension, well, I'd like to throw open and ask what others participating this evening feel about that, because I've tended to be a little bit of a skeptic. I think some critics have tried to draw too short and direct a line of cause and effect between imperial hangovers and the Brexit debates. I certainly don't want to suggest that those connections are non-existent or unimportant, but they're rather more complex than is sometimes thought. And it may well be that actually Brexit debates and quite a lot else in contemporary Britain, perhaps especially England, has actually been shaped more by imperial nostalgia, imperial amnesia than by imperial nostalgia. As for the notion of Northern Ireland colonial society, well, in a nutshell, to cut a complicated story short, and I do want to be brief, I'll try and finish in a few moments. Historically, this is evidently an important aspect of the history of the region, but there are major problems, both analytical and political, in trying to analyse Northern Ireland's present and possible futures in those terms. Analytical problems in that we could argue, I think effectively, and it has been argued by some specialists, that the distinctively settler society dimensions of Northern Ireland eroded, more or less withered away a long time ago. Politically, the problem in a nutshell is that that framework seems to me much better suited to explaining the persistence of conflict than its transformation or its ending. It may even indeed tend towards a view that conflicts up there are necessarily permanently fixed and insoluble. Now, as I've said, there's been a great richening and transformation of the historical literature on Ireland's place in the British Imperial system. It would be almost unfair amidst that to single out a few individual contributions. But I'd like, for instance, perhaps, to mention that and Brendan O'Leary has recently produced an absolutely massive 3-volume treatise on Northern Ireland, as he calls it, which includes centrally arguments about the place of colonialism and colonial legacies in Northern Ireland. Much more brief, you'll probably be relieved to hear, are 2 pieces of work in progress I'd like to highlight. The work on the early modern period, especially the 16th and 17th centuries, of Jane Ulmer, and the even wider ranging and partly present-minded work in progress of another old friend and a Cork man, Joe Ruane. Now, in the past, sometimes historical debate, again, I've implied this already, tended to get polarized around what I always thought was a badly posed question. Simply, was Ireland historically a colony or not? Again, to cut a complex story very short, I think it is historically a society that had colonial features mixed with others. But that in a way doesn't take us very far, because when historians have got away from the false either-orness, they've tended to reach, sometimes a little bit helplessly, for labels like just complex, ambiguous, anomalous, perhaps above all, hybrid, to describe Ireland's historical relation to empire. And that category of the hybrid experience became a bit of a black box, really, pointed towards, but not opened and unpacked. And Joe, I think now more than anybody else in this work in progress, is unpacking it, that box, arguing that, as I have also done, and a number of others, for instance, might mention another Cork University College person, Hiram Morgan, that Ireland's colonial experience is part of a long European history, going right back to ancient times of expansion, conquest, and overrule within the European continent and its islands. It became intermingled in the Irish case, as in some others, with the growth of transatlantic and then, of course, global colonial expansion. But Joe argues, and I would agree, overall, the European connections and parallels have been and are more important than the Atlantic ones for explaining Irish historical experience. Now, I think I should say a word addressing William Thompson gathering in Cove about a specifically Cork dimension to this, and about a specifically or Irish socialist tradition dimension. First, for Cork, well, Cork, of course, has played, whether among historians or more broadly, at least its full share in the wider debates about Irish historical and its relationship with empire. But there's also been, sometimes in my eyes a little bit depressingly, of highly local and often quite angry debate about what happened and really, if you like, who killed whom in County Cork almost exactly 100 years ago. And these arguments, substantially prompted by the work of the late Peter Hart, have sometimes, though only I think in a minority position, had a specifically imperial legacy dimension, in that it would appear that for some protagonists, whether in conflict 100 years ago or historical argument today, there was a tendency to see Cork County's Protestant or Unionist or Loyalist population, I know they're not synonyms, but are often used as being so, as in some sense still a settler or even a garrison population, whilst some others, more on the other side of the debate, have tended to argue very contentiously that partly because of such perceptions of an imperial dimension, there came to be a strong, specifically sectarian element in the IRA's campaign in Cork in the War of Independence and after. So there has been a specifically Cork dimension, often a very contentious one to these debates. How about a specifically left dimension? Well, again, I want to try, I'd go on too long, to unpack the complexities, but I think we could well say that the Irish left has had deep and complex divisions, past and perhaps still, though to a lesser extent, present, between those who tended to see their task, their historic mission, as above all an anti-imperialist one, and this was a view predominant amongst, obviously enough perhaps, what you could call left Republicans, and on the other side, or sides, those, including ones who adopted a more classically Marxist approach, who tended to see the key tasks and the key conflicts as being more about social class and often more internal to Ireland as opposed to those of external domination or oppression. Well, I promised to address not only the historical past with a glance to the present, but also the future. And here I just want to throw open as a set of questions for others to comment if they wish. I began by saying I think there's been comparatively little and perhaps surprisingly little Irish resonance for the wider current European debates about empire legacies. And maybe that owes something to the historical entanglements of thinking about Irish experience as involving elements of being colonized, but also Irish people as colonizers. It's also, I think, intriguing to note that some situations elsewhere that are often and perhaps increasingly viewed by many as colonial ones have had quite strong resonances in Irish political debate in the present, and likely to be at least as much so in the near future, I think. That includes, again, the Israeli-Palestinian situation, but it also includes ideas about American empire, ideas indeed about the European Union as a sort of new imperial formation, an idea that naturally has been put forward by ardent Brexiteers, and it's probably obvious that I'm very much not one of them, but also by some more analytical or less passionately engaged analysts as well. So I guess I'd close for now by simply asking, is empire in any sense an issue, let alone an important issue, for Ireland's and indeed Britain's political present and future? Should it be considered as such? And what might be the implications for our other debates and interests of how we answer that question? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It was such a fantastic, compact thread of narratives that you outlined, in very rich, very dense, lots of ideas, but also very importantly, lots of questions, which I believe are also very kind of at the core of what we've been trying to do here with this series of events. For me, it's quite important that you try to explore questions, the specificities of the role played by locations such as Cork City and Cork County, or and particularly Serious Art Centre being an organization based in Cove, formerly known as Queenstown, and a site of departure for many immigrants, but also site of trade, being at the core of Cork Harbour. And when I moved to Cork City and started to know more about this place, it has always been very curious and fascinating to me, these connections with trade, and the fact that the whole area where I am, it's historically based around that, but somehow a lack of, or maybe I'm wrong, or maybe this is only my perception, but somehow a lack of understanding of the connections that trade has with colonial expansion, and how this part of the world might have been pivotal within the context of the British Imperial system. So it's for us very important to actually mark that, and also the references that you made at the end around the Irish left and socialist traditions within republicanism, or other understandings of the role that left-wing thinking at the time was playing. I think, and also very important, and I think that's where maybe we could start, and I'll just ask something and then everyone will have the opportunity to also ask questions. It was very interesting to hear you speaking from where you are and your particular position as a researcher and a thinker, that current of, say, the events that we've been witnessing, say, for in recent years, specifically since the interconnection between the COVID-19 crisis and the re-emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement last year, say, for instance, in my field of practice, which is, say, the museum sector or the arts sector, and there has been a very strong convergence between a stronger drive towards what we call the decolonization of collections, and recent debates in the UK even around the Benin bronzes and the role that the British Museum plays in holding colonial histories and artifacts. So So the drive towards addressing that, and concurrently the drive towards addressing the whiteness of institutions in the arts, and the fact that many institutions in the arts were bailed out by governments, particularly in the UK, but still were laying off a lot of staff, and most of the staff being staff who is not from ethnic minority backgrounds. So that, and then you said something like, you feel that there is maybe little resonance of these questions and debates in Ireland. And I was curious to understand why you feel, on one hand, why you feel you have this perception, or if it's more a perception, or if you feel that is more based in sort of conversations you have with colleagues or research. And then assuming that's correct, why do you feel is that? Is that because of this convoluted positioning of the Irish population with respect to being understood as objects of colonialism, but on the other hand, not understanding themselves as actors in colonial narratives as well? You see what I'm not sure if I made myself clear. Yeah.
Gosh, well, it's a multi-dimensional question. As you say, museums, art galleries, but also things like places like historic country houses in Britain and elsewhere have become major sites of debate in the very, some cases not for the first time, but certainly more intensely than before, as have universities, colleges and schools. And I hope my impression that, or rather I should say, not I hope, I don't mean a value judge, I think that my impression that this has not been yet very strongly echoed in Ireland is based on trying to follow Irish developments, but I'm sure not as fully or as well informedly as I should be. I think I would say that this difference is, as you suggest, partly due to a perception of the imperial dimension of Irish history as being that of victims, colonized, rather than seeing the more complex picture of Ireland or some Irish people as partners in imperial projects, settlers in imperial colonized places, etc. So it may be that insofar as debates in Britain, France, the Netherlands and elsewhere, not least Portugal has become a little bit some of these historical and political arguments than a number of other former imperial powers in Europe did. But certainly Portuguese historians and others have begun just recently to contribute very vigorously and interestingly to it. Unfortunately, quite a lot of them have been writing in English, which is good for me, who shamefully doesn't read Portuguese. So it may be that there is more in these respects going on in Ireland than I know, but not very high profile. I noted a few exceptions, perhaps straws in the wind, if you like. It may also be that another factor here is that the multi-ethnicization of Ireland's population has been more recent, slower, still on a comparatively smaller scale than is the case for, say, Britain or France, the Netherlands or Germany, and that it might be that it's just in that sense too soon still for the voices, whether as historians, as political commentators, etc., of recent migrants and their families, often from formerly colonized places, that it's still a bit too soon for that really to be heard in Ireland. But I would guess and hope that it will be. I think I should also say, though, that I've been struck, perhaps especially in following the sometimes very heated South African debates on these issues, and the idea of decolonizing educational and other institutions, that idea of intellectual and institutional decolonization has simply been used in too many diverse ways to mean too many different things, and often without enough clarity about what exactly people mean by it. And I could think of also some very local Oxford, where I live, resonances of that. It's in relation to the University Museum and some of its ex-colonial holdings, or to the university's courses. So I'm going on too long, but just add finally, since you began by talking about trade, yes, obviously important in its relations to empire, but maybe here especially important to current arguments has been a very particular and horrible kind of trade, the Atlantic slave trade. Uh, that's the aspect of imperial legacies. Of course, slavery and empire weren't the same thing, but they were totally intertwined for a few hundred years. That's been probably the highest profile of all aspects in Britain, but also increasingly, say, in France or in the Netherlands. Now, Ireland's role in relation to that was until recently very under-examined. There was rather little involvement of Irish ports or Irish-owned ships in actually transporting enslaved Africans across the seas, but in quite a few other ways, Ireland's economic and other interconnections with the Atlantic slave trade were substantial. Uh, Probably the fullest account of this so far is by Nini Rogers, but again, others, perhaps ever more, historians and others have been engaging with this. Sorry, I've gone on too long, but it was a big question.
No, thank you so much. It was really illuminating, actually. I don't want to monopolize the debate, but I will only make a comment also as someone who is not born in Ireland, but also someone who works for Series Art Centre. So a very specific comment that is just an anecdote, but might be of interest for reflection and also for you, Stephen, in the future. Series Art Centre is actually an organization which occupies a building historically, an historic building that was the clubhouse of the Royal Cork Yacht Club.
Oh.
So it is a building that has in its own fabric these histories. And it's an interest. So basically me and Brian, we're working on looking at the building from an architectural historic viewpoint and try to understand how this type of heritage is very much connected with the British presence, but also the questions around the empire here. But it's not very looked at. The building has probably never really been looked at in that way. And this is an effort we need to do. So this was really important. But on the other hand, as someone who comes from the museum sector, I would actually have thought that exactly because Ireland or Irish institutions can be in this ambivalent position of representing the colonized subject within the context of the relationships with Britain, but also having part of British imperial formation. But I would say that exactly because of being able to say they are colonized subjects or a sort of a remnant of that, they could have been much more progressive and advanced much further the colonization of the museum or the university, both sides of knowledge production. And in recent months, since the Humboldt Museum in Berlin has decided that the beginning of the repatriation of the Benin bronzes and questions around that in Britain have escalated.
Yes.
Here, there is also a couple of institutions who say we also have examples of that. We maybe also consider doing it, repatriate them. While you could say they could actually take this opportunity as representatives of somehow a colonized subject actually move forward with that much more quickly and set up an example. So this is some things I've been thinking about, and I thought would be interesting to just leave, to share with all of us. But maybe I should hand over now to anyone else in the room, please. Feel free to
I just follow up on what you were saying, Miguel, about the kind of the legacy in terms of architectural heritage and other cultural heritage from colonialism in Ireland. I worked in the heritage sector for a long time, and it struck me that there's definitely a strong link between colonial legacy in terms of its physical legacy and class in Ireland. The appreciation and protection of our built heritage is often seen as kind of an upper class pursuit and taste that is connected to colonial legacy and the legacy of wealth in the country. So Cove, for example, is an admiralty town. It's a striking Victorian kind of seafront, all that kind of stuff. But I often get the impression that it's some of that kind of historic architecture in Ireland is seen as the responsibility of those who can afford it, and that those people are then connected to the legacy of colonialism and wealth. And it creates an issue in terms of preserving heritage in the country, because it's not seen as the Irish responsibility rather than kind of colonial ruins. And I think a lot of it suffers for that as well. That was just one thing I wanted to follow up to Miguel. And the other thing I wanted to say was that overall, I think the planning and the PR exercise around the decade of centenaries has been very good. It's been very carefully constructed at a national level and a county level. And the tone of everything has been very balanced, and it's definitely focused on the complex histories in a very kind of tasteful and respectful way, which I think is a breath of fresh air, given how significant a centenary it is for everybody, not just those with polarized views, that sometimes these issues are co-opted by people of one extreme view or the other. And I found it refreshing to be able to partake in some of these events as somebody who doesn't have extreme views, but at the same time appreciates the significance of the events and the centenary. And I've gone to a few of the events at some of the important sites, the ambush sites, for example. And I've witnessed some very moving and respectful ceremonies, which weren't extreme, but acknowledged the history and its complexity in a very respectful way. But I've also witnessed people using the platform to express their extremist views or xenophobic views, which to me seems disrespectful to the people who were involved at the time, who were doing quite brave and horrific things for something they believed in at the time. And I think now it's not anybody's place living today to express hatred or judgment on the behalf of those people who gave their lives. So I think overall, it's been very well done and very balanced. And I suppose what I wanted to ask on the back of it to you, Stephen, is how have other countries who have these kind of complex histories and colonial pasts dealt with, for example, the physical legacy of colonialism, the infrastructure, and the built heritage, and also the commemoration of struggles, I suppose we will call them that, and fights for freedom, and have they managed to do it in a way that's current and respectful? And I suppose one of the things, to be a bit more lighthearted about it, one of the things I often say to people who I know personally are what we call armchair Republicans. That I often quote the Life of Brian and say, "What did the Romans ever do for us?" And I start to list a lot of the more kind of pleasing legacies that we have, just to be provocative, I suppose, but just so that it's not as one-sided as people like to believe.
Gosh, thank you. Well, perhaps first I should say I entirely agree that those aspects of the decade of centenaries that I've seen, participated in, read, etc., have been impressive in the attempt to reach balanced views, and perhaps above all in that emphasis that you mentioned on historical complexity. Now, it may well be that a besetting sin of historians and other specialists is they're always going to turn around and say, oh, the picture being given is still not complex enough. You know, we're often an ungracious lot in that sense. So I would say sometimes it hasn't seemed quite complex and multifaceted enough, but it certainly has been impressive. Also, when you began by mentioning built environment and its relationship with historical perceptions, the idea that certain kinds of historical sites, buildings, etc., were shamefully neglected in Ireland, of course, not only there, and that this may owe something to a perception that they really belonged to somebody else, that somebody else being the ascendancy, settlers, imperialists. Well, yes, and if I think whether of the debates about how for a long time some of the most glorious bits of Georgian Dublin were neglected or demolished, or think of the fate of many a former great house across Ireland and not least in Cork, especially West Cork, then yes, this is obviously true and has often been rather sad, but I think again has been changing. Your question about how other European countries have dealt with these legacies, including the physical legacies, gosh, well, there will be at least as many different answers to that as there have been countries in Europe or even institutions involved in history in the countries of Europe. Some have come to this only much more recently than others. I think in many ways, France would stand out as the country where these arguments were highest profile among the major European states. But there, they tended to be very much focused on Algeria, and particularly the end of empire in Algeria and the long and bitter guerrilla war there, with perhaps not so much attention to other places. In Germany, to cut a complex story short, I think Germany has been in many ways immensely admirable for how it came to terms with and the kinds of debates that it harbored on the Nazi legacy and its overseas African and other imperial legacy, until recently was quite neglected. But I think in the very recent past, German debate, whether amongst historians or in a wider public culture, has very strongly made up for that past relative neglect. So I could carry on multiplying, but maybe I should also note those countries in Europe that conceive of their pasts as being, above all, colonized rather than colonizers, like the examples I just mentioned. And here we've had some fascinating recent discussions, and last time we could all meet in person in Kiev before lockdown started, of a predominantly Irish and Ukrainian conference. There'll be a book coming out seeking to compare the historical experiences of empire and colonialism of, if you like, the two outermost edges of Europe, West and East, Ireland and Ukraine. So here too, there's quite an explosion of debate and ever more in-depth thinking comparatively about different experiences. So I could say almost that in terms of historians' debate and research, and perhaps more widely, we're really coming into something of a golden age of the subject right now, I hope. In Britain, well, a very mixed and more difficult story. I could go on and on about it, but I'll maybe note that I think in Ireland, and as say in Germany, but unlike Britain, historians and historical events have been quite central to a wider public culture and political and cultural and social debate. So Britain has lagged behind in that. Sometimes one even feels a little envious of some of one's Irish or say German colleagues because they have such a place in a wider public debate that one has to struggle for in Britain.
Okay. I would like to open the floor. Brenda, please.
First of all, thank you very much, Professor Howe, for sweeping run through this kind of complicated history. Just two things. They're sort of not really questions, more comments. Well, it is a question. I just wonder about the dominance of the English language everywhere now, and especially in terms of scholarship, and how that is impeding a richer view from non-English speaking countries. I'm an art historian. I've just had some experience in being involved in a publication from all over Europe, where all of the languages were translated into English. And so we're hearing for the first time what art critics were saying in this particular instance about the reception of American art during the Cold War. So, I suppose my question is, what's your view about the dominance of the English language itself and the problems about that? And the other thing is just a comment. I'm lucky enough to live in Italy for part of the year, of course, before COVID, but I was very impressed in going around some of the medieval cities in Italy and seeing, in the midst of all the wonderful Renaissance or Baroque architecture, a totally fascist building. And they leave them there deliberately as a reminder of their fascist past. And so I kind of thought that was, and I agree with you about the German response in tackling their horrific past. So thank you. I've enjoyed your talk very much.
Well, thanks very much. When you described it as sweeping, of course, it was much, much too sweeping, but in a way it had to be when it's a big subject or cluster of subjects and short time.
Sure.
The global dominance of the English language, well, of course, sometimes I feel sort of selfishly grateful for that as a native English speaker.
So do we.
But knowing also that it tends to make us lazy about a command of other languages. Now, an awful lot of international and indeed global debates, whether it's historical or other, if they didn't happen in English, they probably wouldn't happen at all. When I referred a moment ago to a big gathering of mostly Irish and Ukrainian scholars, for instance, of course, we were conducting that entirely in English. When Israeli and Palestinian historians, political analysts and others engage in dialogue with each other and more globally, they do so almost entirely and ever more in English nowadays. And one could say that of more and more places. So the English language is one, and maybe you could even say the most important of the legacies of empire, but not only of empire, because its biggest driver in the 20th century was American global influence. You know, and in some ways it's been beneficial. It's also involved a great deal of what critics would call cultural imperialism, of suppression or at least neglect of other languages, of more local traditions, etc. So there's a price. And maybe I'd even say of that, as I would of some other legacies of empire. Well, I wouldn't quite call my Marxist, but Marx has always been very important to my thinking. You know, famously and ever since controversially, he said of British rule in India that whatever its crimes and its follies, it was in a sense an engine of historical progress, bringing India into a mainstream of world development. Could we maybe say that of other aspects and other places as well? You know, maybe seeing both sides in that sense, in the way that the good old Carl sought to do, is important. That there are positives as well. Though in some places, in some contexts, it's very understandably regarded as pretty heretical or horrifying to say that.
Sorry, just one last thing, if I could. This is typically Irish, but are you related in any way to the Marquess of Sligo? I've forgotten his complete name, but it was Howe. It was the same name, and he was the one who was governor of Jamaica and oversaw the end of slavery in Jamaica.
Yes, I know, and there seems to be a very, very far back, only very possible slight connection, but very slight and very distant, if so. No, the Howe side of the family, my father's and his father's, were Londoners of several generations, and all my immediate family, both my parents and all my grandparents were born in London. But before that, family did come from all over the place. Also, no relation that I know of to the Cork, County Cork, mostly farming Howe family. I've often been asked when in your part of the world whether there's connection. Some County Cork ancestors, but they were Sullivans like half the county. Or Sullivans and Beamishes and even hyphenated Beamish Sullivans. So I had to get that in somewhere, that there is a distant trace of some Cork connections.
Thank you.
Micah, Colette, any questions?
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. It's definitely been food for thought. I'm from the Netherlands myself. I've been here 15 years now. And it's really been mind-opening to live in a perceived as non-imperialist country. So I've learned a lot in recent years about the complex history, but still learning. So I get the impression as an outsider that Ireland has, in the past 100 years, been trying to come to terms with all aspects of imperialism. Yes, mostly from kind of the victimized perspective, but in recent years also has been looking at the role they played in imperialism. So was it earlier this year? I think there was Douglas Week organized by UCC. And they were examining these kind of topics as well. There's a book written by some scholars from UCC and in Cuba as well about the role of Irish migrants in Cuba. It's really interesting where they played. But both kind of the role of slave owners, but also fighting for abolition. So it's very interesting. But yeah, so I do see that has started to kind of play a role, and that there's discussions being held, but not at a higher level, maybe like you said. And what you pointed out as well is that the racial diversity in Ireland is rather a new thing. So that might also be a reason why Irish people seem to think there's no racism in Ireland, but there is racism in Ireland, of course. And some argue that that is also kind of inherited by being colonized. I don't know if that is true, that you could argue that, but the other question what I'm wondering is that, yeah, some people would have been forced to go out and work for the English and to go other places because they didn't have any opportunities here. So I guess, yeah, what I'm wondering is some people were willingly doing so, some people felt forced maybe to do so. So I think there's all kinds of layers maybe to it, to why Irish people would have been part of the imperialism as well. And it's also interesting that indented servants who would become free, properly free people who would sometimes then take slaves themselves, and others might have been fighting for abolition. So I think there's so many layers there, and yeah, I don't know. Do you have any knowledge or thoughts on that? That's my question.
Well, I'm certainly not a specialist, but I've read a great deal of, I hope, the most important and a cross-section of the historical literature on these issues. Though one thing that I think I've missed, I'm afraid, is this book you mention on the Irish experience in Cuba. I must look for that. Well, yes, as you say, there has been an ever-growing and, as I stressed, rapidly growing and ever more diverse historical literature on many of these different experiences. And again, it would be to start singling out and name dropping one or two individuals when there's been such a lot. And among other things, a set of too simple historical images have been challenged and complicated. Now, there was a tendency in some quarters, for instance, to stress only or mainly historical Irish, including, and some would say especially so-called Anglo-Irish experiences as imperial governors, administrators, generals, etc., and indeed, in some cases, as slave owners and slave dealers. And in some other quarters, perhaps more influential ones in the recent past, a tendency, say, to think only or mainly famine era and post-famine era very poor and in effect often forced immigrants from Ireland, or mostly a little earlier than that, of those who were sent out to the colonies as indentured servants that you mention, whose status is sometimes seen as being broadly analogous to slavery, or indeed of political exiles and transportees like United Irish veterans shipped out to the chains. Now, those are important historical experiences as well, but we need, so far as we can, so far as both our time and expertise for reading allows, and as our capacity for empathy allows, to bear both of these sides and more in mind, to recognize that the image, though it's an attractive one, of the Irish as somehow naturally anti-imperial, anti-slavery, anti-racist precisely because of historic Irish experiences of conquest and oppression. It's sadly at best too simple an image. One can certainly find people for whom that was the case, and they include some important figures in the nationalist tradition. I suppose most prominently and obviously, Daniel O'Connell was a strong abolitionist, but some other people usually regarded as key figures in the nationalist tradition, like say John Mitchell, were firmly and fiercely on the other side and pro-slavery. And this is something that's also been explored. When Irish nationalists and other Irish people, say in the 19th or early 20th centuries, did seek to link up with or express sympathy for movements for independence elsewhere, they did tend to look to, well, to put it bluntly, white people elsewhere struggling for independence, whether it was in the British dominions or other settler colonies or elsewhere in Europe. And sometimes you even find people arguing that the fact that Ireland wasn't independent, that the Irish were not truly free, was peculiarly unjust because the Irish were after all white, with the implication that, this might be okay for black and brown people to be or even enslaved, but not for white people.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, the book is called Entangled Histories, Cuba and Ireland. Yeah.
Right.
I think Catherine and John had their hand up a minute ago.
Yes. Yeah, Catherine and John, do you want to ask your question or make your comment?
Okay. Yeah, it's bringing it back to actually something much more recent around the Black Lives Matter protests from last year. Actually, they were organized, the Cork City ones were organized from very young people from Cove, actually, which is kind of interesting enough. But as being involved in, say, a Marxist organization, one of the things that come up a lot and have obviously come up in relation to Black Lives Matter is the issue around whether you can have capitalism without racism. Another question is obviously whether you can have capitalism without sexism, And so that would have been a question that we would have been discussing quite a lot in relation to around the Black Lives Matter. We have connections. We'd have a sister party in America, that would be very, very much involved around those issues. And actually, I see America as kind of in relation to, say, identity politics, because somebody was saying to us recently, oh, as a Black person, why would I join an organization that's dominated by white people in Ireland as opposed to fighting for issues particularly to do with race, and you get the same issue around things to do with sexism, say. But so yeah, because I didn't really look much into the talk, so I just saw the thing around Thompson as being an early socialist, so I was interested in a bit more in that. But I did want to bring up that issue around the class and colonialism, and it's also the thing about, say, museums and cultural institutions, and of being that so decolonializing them. But could you, if you take it a bit further, could you actually decolonialize to do with class as well? I mean, these organizations were, I mean, we have things in Ireland that obviously we wouldn't have because we got money coming in from Britain, I mean, so can you see it being taken further? I just read an article in Art Forum a few days ago, and it was actually ended really well about well, we just need to take all the statues of all the colonialists, all the imperialists, all the sexists, all the misogynists, all the rapists, and put them on the borders. And so we get rid of the borders and people can just walk in. And we have no borders. It's kind of a thing about the future. But so I want to actually have the kind of orientate the conversation more a future direction as well, you know, because I just thought it would be a bit more around, more kind of, I get a bit more around maybe the socialist aspect, you know, as opposed to the colonial. Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you. Yeah, more a comment than a question, really. But
yeah,
I think on the specific issue of what to do with the statues and other memorials of slave traders and imperialists and oppressors, I'm in favor of keeping them, but keeping them in museum type places where they can be properly and critically contextualized. You know, I'm on the whole not in favor of simple destruction, certainly when it happens without thinking about what to put in their place. But you know, I sympathize with the emotions of those who have gone in for straight destruction of objects like that. But it's a bit short-sighted. It can sometimes be a loss to historical understanding. On the much wider issue, goodness, well, in a sense, for socialists, feminists, anti-racists, etc., across all of modern history and across the whole world, one of the most constantly recurring sets of questions and debates is about relationships between race and class, sex and class, race and sex, and all of these and capitalism and all of these and colonialism. Now, obviously, the response should be, but I'll say it's too easy a response. One should try to think of these things together and in their interconnections, and thinking important historical and political contexts of specifically ideas of colonial capitalism, to ask what made capitalist economics different under colonial conditions can be important, and quite a few historians and others have engaged with this. And on the other side, we perhaps need to ask, is it a contradiction in terms, as orthodox Leninists at least used to believe, to talk about self-proclaimedly socialist countries as being imperial or imperialist? I'd say obviously not, because I'd say the Soviet Union quite obviously was an empire. And from some perspectives, China is an imperial system today and has been historically. But again, I'm giving too long and convoluted an answer, sorry. But finally, just note the notion of racial capitalism, which I think was first put forward by an African-American historian, Cedric Robinson, nearly 40 years ago, has had quite a revival in the very recent past. And I think it's quite an interesting and important notion to think about the ways in which, perhaps especially or most obviously in the development of the modern Atlantic world and its economic systems, racism and capitalism were intertwined. Could one exist without the other? Big open question. Abolishing one necessarily solve the other? Pretty obviously not, I'm afraid. So the idea of racial capitalism, and actually Cedric Robinson, almost as the other side of the same coin, wrote a fair bit about specifically Black Marxist things. So thinking of some of the important Black Marxist thinkers and pioneers, past and present, might be quite a good response to the people you mentioned who don't want to take part in socialist organizations because they say they're white dominated. It's certainly historically not only a white tradition. And we could add, sorry, final point on all that. In a forum named for William Thompson, it could be said, in terms of these categories, William Thompson was a descendant of settler colonists, and of course came from rather a wealthy family, though I gather he rather nobly disavowed his inheritance and tried to give it all away. And he was, of course, also, I wish I knew more about him, something of a pioneer feminist as well as socialist. So thank you. Sorry, I've answered every question or comment too long and convoluted.
No, it's very important that you actually make that remark around Thompson. Indeed, he could only be what he was, I suspect, also from the little knowledge I have about him, because he was from a wealthy Irish Anglo heritage. But to go back, just Catherine, a point I could make, not necessarily addressing your comment, but an extra comment from coming from England. Before I've been here for 2 years, I was in England for 3 years, and questions around, it seems to me that questions around social inequality related to class are much more prevalent in Ireland than questions surrounding identities or minority identities or the racial divide. While in England, I could see that questions around identity were much more kind of part of my everyday life and my discourse and the discourses of others that I was involved with and the public and in general debate. So I guess it's quite interesting that from what Catherine was coming from, like the idea that you have still a friction, let's just say, a tension between an understanding of the relationship between class and race with respect to, say, oppression and other systems of power. But this is something we could also elaborate further and talk more and see the specificities of, and also, Stephen, you also mentioned before the fact that somehow the presence of people of non-white origin here in Ireland it's not yet as strong, say, as for instance in England, and this is also related to historic colonial narratives, right? We have maybe 5 minutes more if someone has an urgent question to ask. Colette, okay.
Just a thought, really, and just going back to a question on racism. So, I mean, racism exists in Ireland before people of colour came to this island. And I think probably the most ubiquitous and silent is traveller racism. And it's not seen as racism. And I think that's probably more damaging in a way, is that it's not visible, it's not seen, because it's been part of our kind of cultural narrative for so long. I certainly witness it in rural communities a lot, and also in relation to, and I'm just kind of wondering, I'm just going to meander a thought here as regards to kind of relationship with land, because I'm also thinking about, I'll call it maybe the special condition that Irish people have with land and property. And I wonder if it's a uniquely Irish thing in relation to a colonial past, and if that, what I'm thinking about is the framing of it, how it's been framed and how it's been understood in terms of the reason why Irish people have such a need for home and possession of land is because of a colonial past. And I wonder if that is understood and experienced differently in other countries, maybe in Europe or elsewhere. And also that often that's what's sort of, that's tied up in is trauma, an experience of trauma, of loss of land, of eviction, of persecution. And maybe there's some kind of, maybe there's some connection there with a disparity that Irish people have towards Irish travellers. or landless. And so yeah, these are just thoughts, and I just wonder if there's other maybe ways of framing it or thinking about other cultures, because it's definitely something that I mean, I grew up on a farm, where there was ownership of land, and I've witnessed that story about the field, and people will murder for field, and I have witnessed feuding neighbors, claiming land and feuding over land. Yeah, I'm just curious as to if there are other ways that other cultures or theories have sort of looked at that sort of relationship with land, and is it always tied up with a sort of colonial trauma past?
Gosh, thank you. Well, would require both a long time and a breadth and depth of global historical knowledge that sadly I don't quite have. There are.
This place would be interesting to, look at, to do further, that I could probably do further research on.
I think that yes, there are many broad parallels in many other places, and indeed one could almost say that every society that is or has in the relatively recent past been a predominantly rural society has a history of strong attachments to land, of conflicts over land, etc. And, as you implied, often nostalgia for rural life, for the ideal of owning one's own land. So, yes, I think you can find that globally, though with many different local variants, maybe given an especial intensity under post-colonial conditions, well, perhaps though almost obviously given a special intensity under conditions where historically it's believed that the land, quote, was stolen from us by them. I mean, for powerful recent analogies, broad parallels, where it's much more urgent and much bloodier than, thank goodness, Ireland or Britain have been for quite a long time. Think of Palestine and attitudes to land and land ownership there right now, and conflicts over it. So the history of disputes over land ownership is very often a bloody history, almost wherever you go in the world, and an emotion drenched. I think, in a nutshell, the greater intensity, say, of such feelings, so far as, as a generalization, I'm sure it is true that they're more intense, more recently present in Ireland than for most people in Britain. A lot to do with the simple and obvious fact that Ireland was a more rural society until more recently than, say, England or Scotland or Wales were, and rural roots are more recently present. And you mentioned growing up on a farm, although actually since adolescence I've spent long periods living, and I live now in a village just outside a city. As I said, all my immediate family are Londoners, and you'd have to go back several generations, I think, in my family before you find any farmers or farm workers. So that difference of places which urbanized and industrialized early and those that did so only later is, I think, a crucial dimension here. As for anti-traveller racism, well, of course, I've often been made aware of this and have read and heard a bit about it. And it has broad parallels, again, in many other parts of Europe. Indeed, perhaps especially in parts of Eastern and Southeastern Europe, anti-Gypsy or Roma or traveller prejudice and sometimes violence and discrimination are perhaps the strongest, most immediate kind of prejudice and discrimination. and in some quarters the most respectable, if you like. And I think sometimes in some places that's because, as you implied, it's seen as a prejudice against a particular lifestyle, one that's seen as being social or even parasitic by those hostile to it, and not seen as hostility to an ethnic or racial group. Whereas obviously sometimes, indeed very often, it is actually racial or ethnic hostility. And people, but, quote, get away with it because it's often not seen as being such.
Okay, so we should come to a conclusion now. Stephen, it has been an honor and a pleasure to be with you for this last hour and a half. I personally learned a lot, and I believe that your knowledge and perspectives have been very important to all of us. As I said, we will be uploading this recording on our YouTube channel page, so you can always revisit it or use it to spread it to others. We will continue our panel discussions in June, and we will be addressing questions surrounding the traveler community in September with another discussion with a scholar from University College Cork. And we will also endeavor to continue addressing critical issues and urgencies in our work, particularly in this series. I hope, Stephen, we will be in touch. We'll be in touch, and I hope we will have opportunities to continue our dialogue.
I hope so too.
Thanks
As
so
I
much.
said, I'm very sorry that I couldn't be there in person and perhaps look at the yacht club architecture.
And I'm sure we'll be able to invite you, say next year, or when we'll have another summer and travel will be easier, because there will be other things to talk about, and I'm sure it will be, and the invitation is now made. So thank you so much to all, and enjoy the rest of your evening, and until soon. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
Thanks.